So hi, I'm David Sanchez, the Director of Ethics and Justice for the Christian Life Commission, and I'm here with a special guest today, Julie Millsap. Julie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, the organization that you're a part of, and what it is that you do?
Sure, I'm Julie Millsap. I'm the Government Relations Manager at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. I also work with an organization called the Renewed Democracy Initiative. And specifically, the Uyghur Human Rights Project is focusing on reporting on and raising awareness regarding the Uyghur Genocide, which is a cause I got involved in after spending a decade living in China.
Wow. And so what time were you in China?
I moved there in 2010, and then we left in 2020, right as the pandemic was kind of ramping up. So
I'm really glad you can be here today to lend some of your expertise, since this is a topic that you're deeply involved in on a daily basis. I see you on Twitter a lot. I'm going to encourage other people to follow you on social media. We can learn a lot more just by some of the posts that you share. But recently I finished the book, How I Survived a Chinese Re-Education Camp, a Uyghur Woman's Story. And after reading this, I think I was struck just by not only the brutality of what's actually happening in these re-education camps, that it's more of just brainwashing and torture and manipulation that's been going on, but also, like, I'm curious, do you have much data on like how many people have actually been in these camps, how many Uyghurs that the Chinese government has put into these places?
the US government estimates that between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs have been detained in the camps. Again, it's hard to get concrete numbers. Some, still believe that may be a low estimate based on people that may have kind of passed in and out, but generally estimates put it at between 1 and 3 million.
Wow, that is an unspeakable amount of people to have gone through that. And how long has it been going on for now?
I mean, really, things started ramping up 2015, 2016. By 2017, it had really just become an awful, awful situation. And then by the time it really got on the radar of the international community, it had already been ongoing for several years. We're now at the point where we're reaching the 6th year of active genocide. So
these camps, it's not just an incarceration. Like, for instance, some of the things that are happening there are women being mass sterilized, brought in at a young age, some of them even betrothed or looking forward to getting married, and now they're no longer able to have kids. But things like that are just heartbreaking on top of the horror that's going on. But in what other ways would you call it an actual genocide that's taking place, as opposed to just some other type of oppression?
there's a few things in particular. So when we look at all of the conditions for genocide that are laid out in the Genocide Convention, actually every single one is being met in the actions of the Chinese government, including separating children from the group. They are forcibly sending young Uyghur children to state-run orphanages, this in spite of the fact their parents may or may not have passed away. A lot of times they're in the camps, and then they are sent to these state-run facilities. Forcible sterilization, preventing births. When you pull up statistics, anyone that's interested could look into Dr. Adrian Zenza's research, has been quite groundbreaking on this. But essentially recently, an independent tribunal in London, the Uyghur Tribunal, also made the determination of genocide based on the birth prevention alone, that they were seeking essentially to breed out the Uyghurs. And so I think a lot of times in a Western context, we think of genocide as mass graves or mass shootings, but in fact, the Chinese government has these more hidden ways of kind of carrying out the same means of eliminating Uyghurs as a people group. So yeah, it's quite horrifying, and it's been, I think, a little bit, to be honest, frustrating to see the international community kind of get dragged down in this debate of whether or not we call it genocide, and how politicized has this word been, because if we're going by the definition, that's all been there for years.
And I guess some people might be wondering, like, this is a huge people group. Like, what did they do? What are they so guilty of that China would view an entire, people group as a threat to their national government, that they would treat them this harshly under the claim that, it's for national security?
Yeah, that's been an easy claim for them to make in some ways because the Uyghurs are predominantly Muslim, although that's not actually true. Like many of the first people to be kind of swept up in this genocide and brought to the camps were intellectuals who may be atheist, agnostic. There's Christians that have been in the camps, but the Chinese government has had this line that they're combating Islamic extremism. Really, we can pinpoint it as being anything that represents separate identity is very threatening to the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Uyghurs, because they have a very distinct cultural identity as well as religious. It makes them people that don't, fall in with the party line easily. They are not worshiping the Communist Party as God. And so to the Chinese government, that's an enormous threat. In addition to that, if you kind of look at the history of the region, it's very rich in natural resources. So I think there are actually many reasons why the Chinese government has targeted the Uyghurs so brutally. But essentially, it's that there's no tolerance for separate identity right now. That's really been the case in China for a long time, and many in the audience are probably familiar with Christian persecution that's happened, but it's really worsened quite significantly under Xi Jinping, to the point that the Chinese Communist Party is really deciding to define what being Han Chinese is, that all other ethnic groups must also adhere to this kind of Han Chinese ethnic identity as defined by the Chinese Communist Party. And so while the Uyghurs have kind of faced the harshest treatment, we additionally can see what's happening in Shanghai right now to Chinese people, and just recognize that in general, the Chinese Communist Party has set itself up against God. It does not view human beings as having innate worth or and doesn't value human dignity. So the Uyghurs were essentially not an easy target, but a strategic target for the Chinese government.
In the midst of all of this, it seems like so little is actually being done. Like I remember being for example, not to upset anyone about this, but it just has to be said. I remember, when the Olympics started, thinking like, how can this be? But then after reading this book, like even more so, like how could we have let China just pretend like nothing is going on when millions and millions of people are being imprisoned, sterilized, brainwashed, killed, and then families being terrorized on top of this, both in and out of the country. So like, what can we do here in the States for something that just seems so untouchable, so out of reach, so out of our wheelhouse, even as far as what we're used to being able to having an impact on?
Yeah, well, it's I completely agree with you. It's shocking, honestly, that in the modern age, we are seeing this kind of whitewashing of such awful crimes. And it does make you feel helpless a lot of times. But I think a couple of things to remember. So, one being, everybody kind of looks back at history, and in particular, I think Holocaust references, unfortunately, are very applicable in this context. And I think a lot of people look at history and say, how could anyone have let that happen? How could people have just stood by while the Jewish people were massacred in that manner? How could people have allowed their neighbors to be taken to concentration camps? How could anyone have allowed the Nazi regime to come into power? And, the answer is not as simple as a lot of us would like to believe. I think that, unfortunately, like a lot of these things happen not because of the actions of a few evil people, but because in general, ordinary people don't do anything to stop it. And so we're kind of seeing that play out with China right now, in that while it does feel far away and feel like we don't have direct control over, a government, for example, that's openly declared itself as atheist and against the values that we hold, and to a people that we'd never heard of, unfortunately, most people before this genocide happened. It can feel far removed from us, but actually the reality, and what I would kind of say to people, is that it's really, really not, unfortunately, because of the world that we live in today and the ties that we have with China, particularly business ties. We actually are the ones that are powering the genocide, and our corporations here in the United States are profiting off of it. And I think if the average American, the average Christian digs into that a little bit and sees the statements that have been made by business executives here in the United States, by people with the NBA, for example, and in Hollywood, have made kind of justifying this genocide, and it's shocking. I've been present in government hearings where business, corporate executives have been brought in to answer for why they're sponsoring the Olympics, and their answers to these questions are just horrifying. And so, those are the people at the top, but we at the bottom are consuming these products. And so, that are being manufactured with slave labor, or where the corporations are deciding to, for lack of a better term, get in bed with a genocidal regime. And so, as ordinary people, we do have a lot of power, actually, and influence. Money is the only language really that China speaks and listens to. And so, particularly in the United States, in the democratic context, we do have an ability to ask our leaders to apply harsher consequences. China should be sanctioned. Where there's political will, things happen. I think we see that playing out with Russia right now. And China should have been sanctioned a long time ago, to the same extent that Russia is being now, to be perfectly honest. So there's a lot of potential for us to bring this to our leaders, to pressure them to do the right thing, to do more, and to let businesses know that we want no part of consuming products that are produced using Uyghur slave labor while this is ongoing. So, and then, I think also not neglecting to pray. And if you're in an area where you have the opportunity to meet a Uyghur, that's great. Listen to their story. If you don't, go online, do some research, and really, I think just begin to pray that the Lord will give you opportunities to be a good neighbor to people that are facing unimaginable trauma. Even here in the United States, if they're here, they have family members that are missing or locked up. Absolutely every single person's affected by this. And it's a really, I think, valuable time for the church in particular to be the hands and feet of Jesus to people that are very hard to reach and normally are very far removed from us, but really need someone to do that at this point in time.
Would you mind speaking just personally? I feel like you have some of your own experience with what it's like to have the Chinese government looking at you through a microscope and even making threats to people back in China because of the work you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bizarre experience. I was having this conversation with a friend actually last night, just talking about how when you work in the human rights arena, you kind of get conditioned to view certain things as normal that are not normal. And we were talking about how we've got to get out of that mindset, and we've got to let the US government know that it's not okay for them to expect us to operate as if this is normal. But, essentially everyone I know that works on human rights, even here in the United States on American soil, does face intimidation, harassment, and threats from the Chinese government. And for those of us that have family members back in China, I am married to a Chinese citizen. My mother-in-law, my sisters-in-law, a lot of friends and family are back in China, and the government doesn't have any hesitation about using those people against you and threatening them and forcing them to make statements. And that has happened to me. Every single Uyghur colleague that I know is going through, much worse. But it's just to illustrate, even for me, as somebody that's never held Chinese nationality, I'm not ethnically Chinese. Really, they have no claim over me. But because I've engaged in human rights work, they've become emboldened to this point where they're not fearful of harassing a U.S. citizen and using my in-laws against me, forcing people, forcing my sister-in-law to say things kind of denouncing me, and
Wow.
even send like messages that were clearly from the authorities, kind of threatening and telling me to think about my child and think about, if I wanted my child to grow up without parents, and just awful things. And, same thing for Uyghurs, they will have family members call them and tell them to stop and beg them to stop, or they will, forcibly detain and disappear people in retaliation. And that happens to people even who are US citizens. And so it's a very real thing for anybody that's speaking against the Chinese regime. And I think it's definitely something that we hope will be addressed, because the United States especially should be a place of refuge and safety for people the Chinese should not feel emboldened to the point of being able to carry that out unchecked without consequence. But again, this is the type of I think the main point to highlight here is the psychological impact that this has on people. And so being aware of that, praying for people again is really valuable, because this entire community, including human rights workers, are dealing with a lot of mental trauma and things like that. So
yeah, I think that's helpful for us to know that even though some of them have made it to the States or to other countries, and that's another thing that the book makes really clear, is that it's not like, yay, now I'm free. Like, China follows you and continues to oppress you and continues to keep you in 24/7 concern for those who you've left behind and those who that they have a direct reach of.
Yeah.
So the stress of that, the stress of your own life, I'd like to know your recommendations for how to pray for the Uyghur, but then also how can we be praying for you in your work?
Yeah, thank you. I think for the Uyghur people, again, just pray for opportunities to serve them, to love them, to be a light to them. I think, to be frank, it's a traumatized group of people, and when people are traumatized, they often inflict trauma on other people, including one another. And so a lot of times, you do see a lot of issues in the community. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of distrust, and people, there are Uyghur believers, so I would encourage people to pray for them as well, because not only are they dealing with oppression from the Chinese government, they also face persecution from the community a lot of times. And so you can be praying for them. And I think just, again, praying that the Lord acts to bring down stop this evil. We know that the Lord hates what's going on. We know that the Lord loves the Uyghur people. And we know that, this must bring pain to his heart as well. So I think just praying to have that heart, then the Lord will give you direction and opportunity. And I think as the church, just, being willing to speak, it's really, really powerful. And I've had Uyghurs, Uyghur Muslims comment to me just about how when they felt like the Muslim world turned their backs on them and deserted them, that Christians and Jews, were the ones that advocated for them, and that were there in the time of need. And I think that's a really powerful statement and something we can continue to lean into. And for me, I think just, I appreciate prayer. Just it does have an enormous mental impact, like working around people that are traumatized and dealing with the consequences myself. And I think I'm a pretty stubborn person. I'm from Texas, so, of course, but I'm like, I can handle it. But it is a different thing. You can prepare yourself mentally for potential consequences. You can know that you're doing the right thing, but it's still emotionally very, very hard to deal with when you feel like it's still, even though it's not my fault, it's still because of something that I did, that people, back in China are facing consequences. And so I certainly just appreciate prayers of protection for like my spirit, my soul, and my mind as well. So
one final question on a lighter note. We've talked before and just talked about the importance in the midst of all of this work of trying to find ways to relax and to escape and to have fun. And I shared my love of video games, and you said maybe I should look into that. Have you played any video games since we last talked?
No, but I watched my son play some. I was like, let me try to dip my feet into this. And, so I could see why it's a distraction. I didn't find it relaxing, because I just thought, if I'm going to get eaten by this monster, it's actually going to give me enormous anxiety. But I could see, I didn't think about anything else while that was happening on screen. So, I can understand it a little bit more now.
I might be able to recommend you some that are not monsters eating you, but more artistic and peaceful, and you can't die.
That sounds great.
Much more stress relieving as opposed to extra stress inducing.
Yes, that sounds great.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and we will keep tabs on you, and I will be bugging all my friends to be following you and the work that you're doing. And so thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.